Let's go ahead and work on the ping at this point. So let's go back to the application and I'm gonna scroll down and copy this function and I'm gonna paste it down here and I'm gonna change the name to ping server. So we're gonna say ping server, so ping server, and this is gonna take the IP address because we need to know which IP address we're gonna be pinging, and we're gonna pass this in as a string, and this function is gonna return void, so the return type is fine here, and we're gonna keep all this code the same. And the first thing I want to do, if you guys remember, we define this filter subject so that we can show the little spinner whenever we're pinging a server. So the first thing I want to do is to omit something on this subject so that the server's IP address can have the little spinner instead of the router. So the first thing we do whenever we call this function to ping a server is to pass the IP address to the filter subject. So I'm gonna call next on this, and then I'm gonna pass in the IP address. So that way the server with that IP address will have the little spinner instead of the little router. So we're gonna show the spinner so that way the user knows that we're pinging the server for that specific IP address. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is we have to call the ping. So I'm gonna remove the server and then call the ping, and then pass in the IP address again. So I'm going to say, here's the IP address, make the call to the backend, ping the server. Now remember, when we ping a server in the backend, it returns the server that is pinged. So if the status was changed, then we're gonna have the server and the response. So what we need to do is we need to wait for the response. So we're gonna do exactly what we're doing here. And then once we get the response, we're gonna set the server that we got from the backend to replace the server that we have in the front end for that specific server that they just pinged. And as you can see at this point, I'm not retaining this data that I get. So whenever I get this data, I just pass it to this observable. So I don't have any way to access it in this specific component. So what I want to do is to define a variable, and then I'm going to store this response inside of it so that whenever I get this response, I can look for that specific server and then replace it and then pass the response again to this observable. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll up, and I need another behavior subject. So I'm going to put my mouse on this line. I'm going to press Shift Alt with the down arrow key so that I can make a copy of this line, and I'm gonna rename this. I'm gonna call it data subject, and this is gonna be of type custom HTTP response because this is the response that we're receiving from the backend. Oops. So I'm gonna copy this and then paste it here instead of string, and we're gonna initialize it with null. We can put null or undefined, either one. So we're gonna start with null. So I'm gonna copy this data subject, and in the ng on init, whenever we get the data, so on this line right here, we're gonna say this data subject dot next, and then we're gonna pass in the response because that's what it's expecting. So all we're doing here is after we make the first call to the backend, so this ng on init is gonna be call, and once we get a response, the first thing we're gonna do is to save the response inside of this data subject so that we can have a copy of this data in the component because we're gonna need it later down here. So that's all we're doing. So I'm defining this data subject, which is a behavior subject of the response, so the custom response, which is what this is. Like if I hover over this, you can see that it's the custom response, which is the response that we get from the backend with all the servers, the status code, the message, everything. So we're saving this data inside of this data subject. Now I'm gonna scroll down. So here then, whenever I make the call to the backend, I'm gonna show the spinner for that specific IP address because this is what this line is doing, line 41. And then I'm gonna call ping on the service, give it the IP address so that you can make the call to the backend and then try to ping the server. And all of this is being done in the backend. So we're doing the same thing again, and we're gonna come back to this in a second. But now we're not gonna start with the loading state because the data is already loaded. So whenever we initialize this ng on init, we got some data at some point, right? So when we call this ping server, we're not gonna say the data is loading because the data is already there. We already received the data. So we have to change the state, and then we're gonna say loaded state because the data is loaded. And then for the data, so I'm gonna copy this and I'm gonna paste it here. So for the data, we don't have this response, right? Because at this point, we're giving the observable something to begin with. So that's with the start with. So we don't have access to this response, which is only going to happen whenever this is resolved. This observable that's going to make the call to the backend whenever it's resolved. So we don't have access to this response in here. So we have to give this the existing data. So the existing data, which is right here. So we can call this. So here I'm going to say this, that, data subject. To get whatever you save in this data subject, you call the value. So this is going to give us all the value or whatever we saved earlier. You can see that is of type custom HTTP response, So we're gonna give this to the UI to begin with. So when this function is called, it's gonna say, all right, I need to make a call to the backend, but I'm gonna start with this data, which is state loaded, because we're not fetching the data for the first time. We're in loaded state, and the data is whatever we saved initially after we call ng on init. So when we call ng on init, we save the response in this data subject, and then here we're just accessing this response, which is going to be pretty much the same response. So we're passing it here to start with while this HTTP call is being made. So now all we have to do with this response whenever we get it is to loop through all of the servers that we have saved in this data subject and then replace the server that we get back from the backend inside of this array so that we can update any updated information that we might have gotten from the backend, which in this case is going to be the status. So if the status of that particular server that we're trying to ping, if this status was updated, then we will have the updated status and then we can show it to the UI. So I'm gonna come here and I'm gonna say this data subject, and then I'm gonna access the value again. And on that value, you can see that we have all the properties that we're supposed to have because we typed this correctly. So what I want to do is to access the data. So I'm going to access the data, and I know the data is an object and I need to access the servers. So I'm going to access all the servers. So the servers, it's an array if you guys remember, and I need to find the index. So I'm going to put opening and closing bracket. So I need to find the index of the server that the user ping and then replace it with the server that we get in this response so that we can get any updated information. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the find index that you can call on arrays and then give it a condition. I'm going to go ahead and put this on the new line, and all I want to do is I want to access all the servers again. So I'm going to copy all this because this is the only data that I can work with. That's the data that I have saved. And then I'm going to say find index because we need to find the index of some server in this list, which is the server that the user pinged. And then I'm going to say for every server in that list, we want to execute some piece of code with the callback function. And again, I'm going to put this on a new line. And I'm going to say if the server that ID equal the response that data that server, because remember when we ping a server in the backend, in this case, what we get in the data is just one server, not the list of all the servers, but we get a server. And if we go back real quick, just to make sure you guys can connect all these dots, if we go back in the custom HTTP response, you can see that the data can be sometimes a list of server, which is the case when we call this servers, we get a list of servers, or it can also be just one server. And that is the case when we ping a server. So whenever we ping a server, this response data will contain a server. It's not going to contain servers, but just one server. And what we want to do is to access the ID on that server. So whatever we get from the backend, whatever server we get from the backend, we're gonna check to see where these IDs are the same. So we're gonna loop through all the servers that we currently have in the front end, and we're gonna say we need to find the index. So this is going to give us the index in this list right here. So the position of that server that we're looking for. And the condition we're giving the find index is wherever the server ID equals the server ID. We could also do this for the IP address because we know that the IP address is always going to be unique for every single server. But ID is a little bit more secure here because we know the backend ID and the front end ID, they're definitely going to be the same. So remember, we put the bracket here, and then we put this code inside of it. So all of these two lines, so line 46 and 47, is going to return just an index. And you can see that we have the opening and closing bracket. So we're inside of the servers, we're going to have this index for that particular server that the user just pinged. So in that case, then we can say set this server. So for whatever index you find for that server, set it equal to the response that data that server. And that's how we're going to update our data subject, because the only thing we have to do is to just replace this server that the user ping with the server that we get in the response just to get any updated information. And then at this point, then for the data, we can also pass the same value because we just updated it. And then we're just going to paste this here. And then we have some cleanup to do. So I'm going to copy this line and then paste it down here and set this to an empty string, because remember, after we process everything, we have to set this to an empty string so that we'll stop showing the loading spinner and then show the loader router so that the user can ping the server again if they want to. And we're going to do this even when we get a failure. So I'm going to go down here and paste this subject next and then pass an empty string so that we can stop showing the spinner even when we have an error, because we don't want to, show an error, say, hey, something happened, we couldn't ping the server, and then the spinner is still spinning. We have to stop the spinner. And that's pretty much everything you have to do for this. And another way we can do this, just to make sure you guys can see this clearly. So I'm going to remove this and I'm going to define another variable up here. I'm going to say constant index and then set it equal to this, just like that. All right. So maybe this can make more sense in case you didn't understand clearly. So I'm going to see if I can put this on a new line. So you see that I'm defining this index here, and we're going to access all the servers and then find the index where the server's IDs are the same. And you can see that's what I'm doing here. And we need to close this. All right. So we're going to find the index by say for all the servers, loop through them, wherever the IDs are the same, then that's the index that you're going to give us for that specific server in the array. And then with that index, so if I make this a little bit smaller, if I put this all on one line, we're going to say index. All right. So remember, this is all of our data. So this is all the list of the servers. So for this particular server at that particular index, replace it with this server that we just got from the backend. So maybe when I put this on two lines, it can be a little bit clearer for you guys. But with defining this index that we're trying to find and the existing data that we already have in the front end, we're just looping through them. And then we call define index, which is going to give us the index. And then we set the condition. We say wherever these two IDs are the same. So the ID of the server that we're looping through that we already have in the front end, whenever these two IDs are the same. So the ID of the server that we got from the backend, you can see we're accessing it from the response. Whenever this condition is met, then that's the index we need to find. So this is going to give us the index of this particular server in the array. And then once we have this particular index, we're going to say, all right, so now that we know the position of this server in the list, then in that same list at this particular position, replace that server with the server that we got from the backend so that we can get any updated information. And that's only going to be the server status because that's the only thing that can change whenever we ping the server. We're not going to change anything else. And then after that, then this data subject, you can see it right here, is updated, and we just return it as the data for the front end. And then after we do that, we stop the spinner. So we pass in an empty string to the filter subject, and then we do the same if we get an error. And that's all we have to do for the ping server. So now what we need to do is to hook this up in the UI and just see it in action.